What happens when one person decides they own a neighborhood they never paid for? Picture this. It is 7 in the morning. The sun has barely come up. Most people on Maplewood Estates are still in their pajamas, making coffee, getting kids ready for school, living their ordinary lives the way ordinary people do. But not Linda. Linda has been up since 5:30. She is already outside. She has her clipboard, the tan one with the metal clamp that she bought specifically for this purpose. She has her camera, a proper digital one, not just her phone. She has her measuring tape clipped to her belt loop like a carpenter heading to a job site. And she has her pen, already uncapped, already moving across the page. She is walking slowly, methodically. She moves from house to house the way a health inspector moves through a restaurant kitchen, looking for violations, cataloging evidence, building a case. She photographs a trash can that is 2 inches too far from the curb. She writes a note about a welcome mat that is the wrong shade of beige. She pauses at one driveway for a long time, tilting her head at an oil stain on the concrete, deciding whether it rises to the level of a formal complaint. She decides it does. By 9 o'clock, Linda is back inside. She is at her kitchen table, which has long since stopped being a kitchen table. It is covered in stacks of HOA documents, printed emails organized by date, folders labeled with homeowner names, and a laminator that she runs at least twice a week. The coffee pot is on her left, the printer is on her right. She is already composing violation notices. This is not a bad day for Maplewood Estates. This is every single day. Linda Marsh had lived on Maple Court for 14 years. For the first 4, she was just a neighbor, quiet, a little intense, the kind of person who noticed when your holiday decorations went up a day before the HOA calendar allowed. But in year 5, she ran for HOA board president. Nobody else ran against her. Turnout at HOA elections in Maplewood Estates was historically around 8%. Linda won with 11 votes. She never stopped acting like it was a landslide. Over the next 10 years, Linda rewrote the HOA bylaws 43 times. She fined homeowners for the color of their shutters, the height of their hedges, the type of welcome mats they used, the number of cars parked in their driveways, the species of flowers in their front beds, and, in one memorable incident, the font on a family's hand-painted address numbers. She fined a widow for leaving her Christmas lights up 3 days past the approved removal window. She fined a young couple for having a for sale sign that was half an inch taller than the HOA's permitted dimensions. She fined an elderly man for feeding birds in his own backyard. Citing a noise nuisance complaint she filed herself, 3 families sold their homes and left the neighborhood entirely, citing Linda's harassment as the reason. At least 2 more seriously considered it. The neighborhood Facebook group had long since devolved into a mix of anxious compliance questions and exhausted resignation. People had stopped planting flowers they liked in favor of flowers they knew Linda would approve. Families avoided spending time in their front yards. Children played in backyards with the gates closed. Maplewood Estates had become a place where people were afraid to live freely in their own homes. And then Rachel Monroe moved in. But before we get to Rachel, before we get to the end of this story, you need to understand what 10 years of Linda actually looked like up close. You need to hear the stories of the people who lived through it, because Linda was not just annoying. Linda was not just petty. Linda crossed lines that should never have been crossed. And for a very long time, nobody stopped her. These are 7 of those stories. These are the stories that built toward the day the whole thing came crashing down. Take a deep breath. Here we go. Your lawn is 3.2 inches. The maximum is 3 inches. You have 48 hours to comply or face a $150 fine. This is your only notice. Mark and Jennifer Calloway had lived in Maplewood Estates for 4 years before any of this started. 4 years of quiet, normal, suburban life. They had a dog named Biscuit. Jennifer had a small raised bed garden along the side of the house where she grew tomatoes and basil. Mark mowed the lawn every Saturday morning without fail, sometimes even on Wednesday evenings if the week had been slow. They were good neighbors. Everybody who knew them would have said so. The first letter arrived in their mailbox in late April, about 6 months after Linda became board president. It was printed on HOA letterhead, official-looking, sealed in a white envelope. The letter informed Mark and Jennifer that their recycling bin had been observed at the curb for 14 hours and 20 minutes on collection day, which exceeded the HOA's permitted window of 12 hours. The fine was $25. Mark paid it because it was $25 and he didn't want the hassle. He told Jennifer about it over dinner. They both thought it was a little ridiculous. They forgot about it within a week. The second letter came 2 months later. This one was about the garden hose, specifically about the angle at which the hose was coiled on its wall-mounted holder. Linda had determined that the hose was not coiled in a consistent circular pattern and was instead in what she described, in writing, as a disorganized heap that constitutes an eyesore visible from the public right-of-way. Fine, $50. This time, Mark called the HOA number listed on the letter. He got Linda's voicemail. He left a polite message asking her to call him back. She never did. He got another letter 2 weeks later, this one reminding him that his $50 fine was now past due and had increased to $75 with the late penalty. He paid it. He told himself it wasn't worth fighting over. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. The third letter was different. It arrived in June, printed on heavier paper than the others, with a red border along the top that Mark had not seen on previous HOA correspondence. It informed him that he was in violation of Section 4, Subsection 2B of the Maplewood Estates Community Standards and Maintenance Guidelines, a section that did not, as far as Mark could recall, exist when they had moved in, regarding lawn height maintenance. His lawn had been measured and found to be in excess of the 3-inch maximum. He had 48 hours to correct the violation. Mark read the letter twice. Then he went outside and looked at his lawn. It looked exactly like it always looked. He had mowed it 4 days ago. He went back inside and got a ruler from Jennifer's craft drawer. He went back out to the lawn and crouched down. He measured a blade of grass, then another, then another. 2.8 inches, 2.9 inches, 3.1 inches near the edge by the sidewalk where the sprinkler didn't reach quite as well. Mark stood up and looked at the street. Linda was standing at the end of his driveway. She had her clipboard. She had her camera. She was watching him. "I'll need you to have that corrected by Thursday," she said, and walked away without waiting for a response. Mark mowed the lawn the next morning. He set the mower deck lower than he ever had before. He mowed it on a diagonal, the way he'd seen on golf courses, and then mowed it again perpendicular to make a proper pattern. He went over the edge by the sidewalk 3 times. He got a violation notice anyway. The fine was $150. The stated violation, uneven mowing pattern creating an aesthetically inconsistent appearance. That was the day Mark Calloway decided to start paying attention. He went to his neighbor Dave Hernandez that evening. Dave lived 3 doors down and had been in the neighborhood for 7 years. Mark asked him if he'd been getting letters from Linda. Dave laughed. Not a funny laugh, a tired one. "How much have you paid so far?" Dave asked. Mark told him. Dave shook his head slowly and said he'd paid over $400 in the past 18 months. He said the Rodriguezes on the corner had paid even more before they just stopped paying entirely, at which point Linda had threatened to place a lien on their property. He said the Pattersons, the elderly couple who'd lived in the greenhouse on the cul-de-sac for 22 years, had sold their home 6 months ago. Their daughter had told Dave that her mother had cried the day they moved out. She had loved that house. She had raised her children there, but she couldn't take it anymore. Mark went home and sat at his kitchen table. He pulled out his laptop. He typed the name of the county and the words OA Bylaws Records Request into the search bar. The county maintained public records of all homeowner association governing documents. Any registered HOA in the county was required to file its bylaws and any amendments with the county clerk's office. The records were available to the public. Mark paid a $75 filing fee and submitted a request for the full document history of the Maplewood Estates HOA. The records arrived by email 3 days later. Mark printed them out, all 247 pages, and spread them across the kitchen table. Jennifer made coffee. They went through it together. What they found took their breath away. The original Maplewood Estates HOA bylaws, filed when the development was first built, were 23 pages long. Reasonable, standard. The kind of document that covered the basics, maintenance standards, dispute resolution processes, how board elections worked, what constituted a valid vote. The current bylaws, as amended, were 91 pages long. Linda had filed 11 amendments in 3 years. Each one added new rules, new violation categories, new fine structures. The lawn height rule was in Amendment 7, filed 14 months ago. The hose coiling standard was in Amendment 9. There was an entire section, 6 pages, dedicated to what Linda called aesthetic consistency standards, which covered everything from permitted exterior paint colors to the acceptable diameter of decorative pots on front porches. And not one of those 11 amendments had been put to a community vote. Not one had been circulated to homeowners for feedback. Not one had been announced at a board meeting where residents were given notice and an opportunity to attend. Linda had simply written them, filed them with the county, and started enforcing them. Mark stared at the pages for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called a lawyer. The grass fine was the beginning of the end of Linda's empire. Nobody knew it yet, not even Mark, but the clock had started. There is a child operating a commercial enterprise on residential property without a permit. I am requesting immediate removal. The summer Tommy Nguyen turned 7, he decided he wanted to buy a remote-controlled dinosaur. He had seen it in a toy store window in March and thought about it every single day since. It was $34.99. He did not have $34.99. His parents told him he could do extra chores around the house to earn money toward it, but at 50 cents, a chore that was going to take a very long time. It was Tommy's grandmother who suggested the lemonade stand. His mom helped him make a sign out of poster board and green markers. Big, wobbly letters that said lemonade 50 cents. She helped him carry a folding table to the end of the driveway and set up a plastic pitcher and a stack of paper cups. She made 2 batches of lemonade, one regular and one with mint from the garden, which Tommy decided to charge 60 cents for because it was fancy. It was a Saturday in July. The temperature was 92 degrees. Tommy was wearing a red baseball cap and a shirt that said Future Scientist. He had a little notebook to write down his sales. By 10:30 in the morning, he had made $11.50. Mr. Kim from across the street had bought 2 cups. The mailman had bought one and told Tommy he was a born businessman. A woman walking her golden retriever had bought one and let Tommy pet the dog, which Tommy said was the best part of the whole day. At 11:15, Linda walked past. She did not stop. She did not say anything to Tommy. She did not ask him what he was selling or how much it cost. She walked past the table, slowed down just enough to look at it, took out her phone, and kept walking. Tommy noticed her, but didn't think much of it. He went back to his notebook. 12 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. 2 officers got out. Tommy stood very still behind his table. His heart was pounding. He had never had a policeman talk to him before, except at the school safety assembly. One of the officers, a tall man with a friendly face, looked at Tommy's sign. He looked at the picture. He looked at Tommy. He asked Tommy what his name was and how much the lemonade cost. Tommy told him. The officer nodded seriously, like he was processing important information, and then pulled 2 quarters out of his pocket. "I'll take a regular," he said. While Tommy poured his cup, the second officer had stepped away and was talking to Linda, who was standing on the sidewalk about 20 feet back. The conversation went on for a while. Tommy couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see the officer's body language change, the slight tilt of the head, the slow exhale, the look of a person who is being extremely patient about something they find genuinely absurd. Eventually, the second officer came back over. He thanked Tommy for the lemonade his partner had bought. He told Tommy he was doing a great job and to have a nice day. The 2 officers got back in their car and drove away. Linda was still on the sidewalk. She looked at Tommy for a moment. Then she took a photograph of the table. Then she left. The lemonade stand continued for another hour and 40 minutes. Tommy made a total of $22. He was $8 short of the dinosaur, but his dad said he'd kick in the rest if Tommy helped wash the car. 3 days later, Tommy's parents received a formal HOA complaint letter. It cited violations of the HOA's commercial activity prohibition, the temporary structure policy, and the community aesthetic standards section regarding items visible from the street. A copy of the complaint had been sent to the city council, the county health department, and Tommy's dad had to read this part twice, the State Department of Revenue, with a note suggesting that the income generated by the lemonade stand may not have been reported for tax purposes. Tommy was 7 years old. He had made $22 selling lemonade. Tommy's dad, whose name was Philip, was a quiet man who generally preferred to avoid conflict. He worked in logistics. He coached Tommy's soccer team on weekends. He was not, by any measure, someone who sought out confrontation. But when he read that letter, specifically the part about the State Department of Revenue, something shifted. He took a photograph of the letter. He posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group with a simple caption: "This is the violation notice our HOA sent because our 7-year-old had a lemonade stand." The police were called. A copy was sent to the state tax department. He did not ask for anything. He did not name Linda specifically. He just posted the letter and let people read it. Within 4 hours, the post had been shared 300 times. By the next morning, it had been picked up by a local news blog. By afternoon, a reporter from the regional paper called Philip's cell phone. By the end of the week, the story had appeared in outlets in 12 states and 2 countries. Linda's name, her home address, and her photograph, pulled from the HOA website she had built and maintained herself, were on the front page of the regional newspaper. Her employer, a real estate management company, received over 200 emails and phone calls from people expressing their feelings about the situation. The company issued a statement saying they were looking into the matter. A petition calling for Linda's resignation from the HOA board was circulated online and door-to-door. 61 of the 64 households on the street signed it. Linda did not resign. She posted a statement to the neighborhood Facebook group, which she had to rejoin after briefly being removed by another admin, explaining that she had acted within her authority as board president, that the media had distorted the story, that the lemonade stand had technically violated 3 separate HOA policies, and that she had a responsibility to enforce the rules consistently and without exception. The post received 0 supportive comments. It received 47 replies, none of which were kind. Linda deleted the post 2 days later. She never acknowledged the incident again. Tommy got his remote-controlled dinosaur. His dad bought it for him as soon as the story went national. It was the least he could do. $22 and a pitcher of lemonade. That's what it took to show the whole country what one HOA Karen could become. Per Section 11C of the Community Standards, structural modifications to the exterior of any unit require prior written board approval. Your ramp was installed without approval. You have 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines and potential legal action. James Whitfield was 34 years old when he moved to Maplewood Estates. He had spent the previous 8 years in the United States Army, including 2 overseas deployments that he didn't talk about much. He came home with a Purple Heart, a Silver Star, a lot of memories he was still working through, and a spinal injury that the doctors told him was permanent. James used a wheelchair. He had been using one for 2 years before he moved to Maplewood Estates, and he had long since learned to navigate a world that was not always designed with him in mind. He was patient about it. He was resourceful. He figured things out. The house on Elm Court had been perfect, almost. It was a single story, which was important. It had wide doorways. It had a garage where James could get in and out of his vehicle using a hand control system. The only problem was the front entrance, 3 concrete steps between the front door and the driveway. With a narrow iron railing that James could not use effectively from his chair, James hired a contractor before he even finished unpacking. The ramp was built in a single day, 6 feet of treated lumber, freshly painted to match the house's trim color, with non-slip strips along the surface, at a small landing at the top where James could unlock his front door without his chair rolling back. It was neat. It was professional. It was modest enough that several neighbors said they hadn't even noticed it until James pointed it out. The violation notice was in his mailbox 4 days later. James read it carefully. Then he went to the county library and spent an afternoon reading about HOA law and the Americans with Disabilities Act. He learned that the ADA generally required HOAs to make reasonable accommodations for disabled residents and that courts had consistently held that wheelchair ramps qualified as such accommodations. He filled out the HOA's formal accommodation request form, which he found on the HOA website, checked it against the legal standards he'd read about, and submitted it by certified mail with return receipt requested. Linda rejected the request in writing 12 days later. The rejection letter was 2 pages long. It cited Section 11C of the HOA bylaws, the structural modification section, and noted that while the board was sympathetic to Mr. Whitfield's personal situation, the accommodation request did not meet the board's standards because A, the ramp had already been installed without prior approval. B, the board had not been given the opportunity to review alternative solutions. And C, the ramp's visibility from the street was inconsistent with the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. Linda's alternative proposal: James could install a ramp, but it had to be located at the rear entrance of the home, not visible from the street. She included a diagram showing where she felt an acceptable ramp could be positioned. James looked at the diagram. The rear entrance she was proposing opened onto a narrow side yard with a gate that James would not be able to open from his wheelchair without assistance. The proposed ramp would have added 6 minutes to the time it took him to enter or exit his own home. Assuming someone was available to help with the gate, going to get his mail, taking out the trash, getting to his car, every ordinary task of daily life, made deliberately harder because Linda had decided a ramp on the front of the house was an eyesore. James's wife, Denise, took a photograph of the rejection letter. She posted it to her personal Facebook page with a caption that said, simply, "This happened." She had 340 Facebook friends. By the following morning, the post had been shared over 40,000 times. A disability rights attorney from the state capitol reached out within 24 hours, offering to represent James at no charge. The county commissioners scheduled an emergency session to review the HOA's ADA compliance. A Veterans Advocacy Organization issued a public statement calling for Linda's removal from the board. The state attorney general's office sent a letter to the HOA requesting documentation related to the accommodation denial. James said very little publicly. He gave one brief interview to the local paper in which he said he had not moved back to civilian life to fight for his right to use his front door, but that he was prepared to do so if necessary. He never had to. 18 days after the rejection letter, Linda appeared at James's door in person. She was carrying a printed letter on HOA letterhead. She handed it to James without making eye contact. The letter informed him that the board had reconsidered his accommodation request and was granting approval for the existing ramp installation, effective immediately. Existing ramp installation, effective immediately. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that the original rejection had been wrong, no recognition that what she had done to a disabled veteran was anything other than a minor administrative matter now resolved. She said, "The board hopes this resolves the matter," and walked back to her car. James brought the letter inside. Denise read it. They were both quiet for a moment. Then James went to his garage, found a frame he'd been meaning to use for a photo, and put the letter in it instead. He hung it in the hallway between his military commendations and a photo of himself, and his unit taken 3 days before his last deployment. He told his daughter it was the most important thing on that wall. When she asked why, he told her it was a reminder that the right thing sometimes has to be fought for, even when it should have been obvious from the start. The state attorney general's inquiry into Maplewood Estates' HOA practices remained open. Linda didn't know it yet, but this was the first thread being pulled from a very large knot. Proposed Amendment 38, unsupervised minors under the age of 14 are prohibited from occupying streets, sidewalks, driveways, or front yards without a parent or legal guardian physically present. Activities producing noise above conversational levels are prohibited in all common and semi-common areas between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. without prior board approval. Read that again. That is a proposed HOA rule banning children from playing in front of their own homes, in a residential neighborhood, in America, in the 21st century. Linda distributed the amendment on a Thursday evening, 1 envelope per household, hand-delivered and slipped into mailboxes after dark. The covering note informed residents that the amendment would be voted on at a board meeting the following Monday at 9 a.m., giving homeowners approximately 90 hours to review, respond, and attend. The meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning, when the vast majority of working adults on the street would be at their jobs. It is worth pausing here to explain what had led to this. 3 weeks earlier, a group of children, 7 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 11, had been playing a noisy game of tag in the cul-de-sac at the end of Maple Court. They were laughing loudly. They were running. One of them, a 9-year-old named Cody, had fallen and skinned his knee on the pavement and cried for about 4 minutes before getting up and rejoining the game. Linda had appeared with her clipboard. She had told the children they were too loud and that they needed to go inside. 3 of them had looked at each other with the particular expression that children get when they are trying to figure out whether an adult actually has authority over them, and have concluded that this one probably does not. They went back to playing tag. Linda went home and spent the rest of the evening drafting Amendment 38. Now, Amendment 38 was in 37 mailboxes, and it was Friday morning. Sarah Chun found her envelope when she went to get the mail before leaving for work. She was running late, so she put it in her bag and read it on the bus. Sarah was a paralegal at a family law firm. She read legal documents for a living. She knew exactly what Amendment 38 said and what it meant. And by the time her bus reached downtown, she had called into work to say she'd be an hour late. She spent that hour making phone calls. Sarah called the 6 neighbors whose numbers she had. She asked each of them to call the people they knew. She texted the neighborhood Facebook group with a message that said, "Has everyone read the amendment in the envelope that showed up last night? Call me." By Saturday morning, the neighborhood was mobilized in a way it had never been before. Families who had never spoken about HOA matters were knocking on each other's doors. Parents were reading the amendment aloud to each other on front porches, voices rising with each clause. The cul-de-sac, the very spot where the children had been playing tag, was full of adults having urgent conversations. Sarah went door to door on Saturday with a printed objection form she had drafted herself. It cited the specific legal deficiencies in Linda's proposed amendment, including its likely conflict with state residential property law, its impossible enforcement standards, and the inadequate notice period before the vote. She asked each household to sign it and to come to Monday's meeting if at all possible. By Sunday night, 37 households had signed. Monday morning's meeting was scheduled for a room at the community recreation center that held about 25 people comfortably. 44 people showed up. They brought folding chairs from their cars. They stood along the walls. 3 of them brought lawyers. 1 man showed up with a video camera. Linda had clearly not expected this. She arrived to find the room already full and stood at the entrance for a visible moment of hesitation before composing herself and taking her seat at the board table. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Homeowner after homeowner stood up and spoke. Parents talked about what it meant for their children to play freely outside. Longtime residents talked about the community they had chosen to move into and what it was becoming. A retired judge named Howard Finch spoke for 11 minutes about the legal deficiencies in the proposed amendment and the liability the HOA would face if it attempted enforcement. Linda attempted 3 times to call the meeting to order and force the vote. Each time, the room refused to be silenced. When the vote finally came, Amendment 38 failed 11-4. 4 board members voted in favor. They were the same 4 who had voted yes on every amendment Linda had ever proposed. After the meeting ended, as people filed out into the parking lot, one of the lawyers who had attended, a woman named Patricia Greer, who lived on the east side of the neighborhood, approached Linda on the steps. She handed her an envelope. Inside was a formal legal notice. It stated that a coalition of 22 Maplewood Estates homeowners had retained counsel and intended to pursue a full legal review of every HOA bylaw amendment enacted during Linda's tenure as board president, with particular attention to the procedural validity of any amendment passed without proper homeowner notice and a properly constituted vote. Linda took the envelope. She read the letter in the parking lot, standing very still. Then she got in her car and drove away. She did not attend the next board meeting. It was the first time Linda had ever lost a vote, and it would not be the last. The cameras are a community safety initiative approved under my authority as board president. I am not obligated to provide residents with access to footage. This matter is not open for discussion. Nobody in Maplewood Estates could agree on exactly when the cameras had appeared. That was part of what made them unsettling. One resident thought she had noticed the first one in late autumn on the pole near the community mailboxes. Another said he'd spotted one on the far fence post by the recreation area as early as the previous spring. A third was fairly sure the ones on the streetlight poles hadn't been there as of the 4th of July because she'd looked up at them during the fireworks and seen nothing. By the time anyone started paying close attention, there were 7 of them, small, dark domes. The kind of camera you see in banks and parking garages, mounted at angles that provided clear sight lines. But to what exactly was what was troubling people? They weren't pointed at the entrances to the neighborhood. They weren't covering the recreation area or the parking lot. They were pointed at houses, at driveways, at front doors. Derek Walsh had lived in Maplewood Estates for 6 years. He worked as a senior network engineer for a regional telecommunications company. He noticed the cameras gradually the way most residents did, but he noticed something else that the others didn't. The cameras appeared to be active, not just mounted, broadcasting. He brought it up at the August board meeting. He asked, politely and specifically, 3 questions. When had the cameras been installed? Who had authorized the expenditure? And where was the footage being stored and who had access to it? Linda told him it was a community safety initiative, that the cost had come from the HOA's discretionary maintenance budget. and that the footage management was a security matter not appropriate for public discussion. Derek asked which section of the HOA bylaws granted the board president unilateral authority to install surveillance equipment. Linda said the meeting was moving on to the next agenda item. Derek went home that evening and set up a signal monitoring device in his driveway. It was equipment he had from work, nothing exotic, nothing illegal, just the kind of tool a network engineer uses to understand what wireless signals are present in an area. He ran it for 2 evenings. What he found was alarming. Linda's cameras were broadcasting on an unencrypted wireless frequency. They were not password protected in any meaningful way. Anyone with the right equipment and the knowledge to use it, which in any given neighborhood was probably more people than Linda would have liked, could access the feed. The footage was being stored on a server that Derek was able to identify through the network traffic, a private server, not a commercial security service, registered to a home address, Linda's home address. There was no community data policy, no privacy notice, no disclosure to residents that their homes, their comings and goings, their guests, their daily routines were being recorded and stored on a server in a neighbor's spare bedroom. Derek documented everything meticulously. He wrote a 12-page report with technical appendices and submitted it to the county sheriff's department. 2 investigators were assigned to the case. They spoke with Derek. They spoke with several other homeowners. They requested that Linda provide documentation of board approval for the camera installation, minutes, votes, notices, anything that showed the community had been informed and had consented. Linda produced a 1-page memo she said she had circulated to the board. 2 of the 4 board members she named as recipients said they had never seen it. The investigators also noted in their report that the placement of the cameras was inconsistent with a general community safety purpose. Of the 7 cameras, 5 were positioned to provide direct views of individual residential front doors and, in 2 cases, windows that appeared to be bedroom windows. The coverage pattern was not what you would design if your goal was neighborhood security. It was what you would design if your goal was watching specific people. The sheriff's department referred the case to the county district attorney's office for review of potential privacy law violations. Linda retained a defense attorney. 3 days after the referral, a crew arrived at Maplewood Estates and removed all 7 cameras. Linda said in a statement that she had voluntarily arranged for their removal. While the legal questions were being sorted out, she was formally suspended from the HOA board pending the investigation's outcome. For the first time in 5 years, Linda was not in charge. The neighborhood was very quiet that week, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was not the quiet of people being careful. It was the quiet of people exhaling. People propped their front doors open, let their dogs sit on the front porch, waved at each other for longer than usual. Small things, but they mattered. Hi, I'm Rachel. I just moved in on Friday. I'm also a licensed real estate attorney with 15 years of experience in residential property law across 8 states. I'd love to sit down and review the HOA governing documents at your earliest convenience. Rachel Monroe was 41 years old, 5'4", and had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had been in enough courtrooms to stop being intimidated by rooms. She had a dog named Claus, yes, named for a legal clause, because Rachel was that kind of person, and a habit of reading contracts the way other people read novels, carefully and with genuine interest in the plot. She had been looking for a house for 2 years. She had walked away from 3 properties in that time, twice because of issues she'd identified in the HOA documents during due diligence. The 3rd time, the seller had refused to provide the full governing documents before closing, which Rachel considered a red flag significant enough to end negotiations. Maplewood Estates had seemed fine on paper. The HOA documents she'd reviewed as part of her purchase had been the originals, the 23-page version filed when the development was built. Nobody had shown her the amended version because nobody had told her there was an amended version. This was not, strictly speaking, legal, but it was what had happened. She moved in on a Friday in October. The first violation notice was in her mailbox by Saturday morning. It was about the moving truck. It had been parked on the street for more than 4 hours on Friday, which exceeded the HOA's permitted window for commercial vehicles. Fine, $75. The second notice was attached to the first. It concerned a flattened cardboard box that had fallen out of a recycling bin during the move and come to rest approximately 18 inches from the bin. This constituted, per the notice, unsecured refuse in a public area. Fine, $50. Rachel read both notices standing at her mailbox in her moving clothes, still holding a cup of coffee. She read them with the particular focus of a person who is not angry yet but is assembling information. She went inside and called the HOA number listed on the notices. She got a voicemail. She left a message requesting a complete copy of the current HOA governing documents, all amendments, the past 3 years of meeting minutes, and the full financial statements for the HOA. She said she needed them within 14 days. Linda called back within the hour. She explained that the HOA's records were in the process of being organized and that there would be a delay in providing them. She suggested that Rachel pay the outstanding fines first, and then they could discuss document access. Rachel told Linda very pleasantly that under the state's Homeowners Association Act, any owner was entitled to receive copies within 14 days of a written request. That failure to comply carried a statutory penalty, and that she had already put her request in writing via voicemail, which she had recorded. There was a pause. "I'll see what I can do," Linda said. The documents arrived on day 13. Rachel cleared her dining room table. She made a pot of coffee. She put on her reading glasses. She started at the beginning. She worked for 4 days. What she found was staggering, even to someone who had seen a great deal of HOA mismanagement over 15 years of practice. 43 amendments to the governing documents, only 3 of which had been preceded by proper written notice to homeowners and a duly constituted vote meeting the quorum requirements set out in the original bylaws. The remaining 40 had been filed unilaterally, written by Linda, signed by Linda in her capacity as board president, and submitted to the county without any community input or approval. Legally, those 40 amendments were almost certainly void. They had never been validly enacted. The fines collected under them, fines for grass height, hose coiling, doormat color, lemonade stands, wheelchair ramps, had been collected under rules that had never legitimately existed. The financial records were worse. The HOA had collected $183,400 in fines and dues over the past 5 years. The financial statements showed $121,800 in documented expenditures, maintenance contracts, insurance, utilities, administrative costs. That left a gap of $61,600 that the records could not account for. The line items were vague. Several referenced administrative expenses or board discretionary funds without further detail. One recurring quarterly only professional services with no vendor name. Rachel noted that Linda had never put the HOA finances to an independent audit in 10 years as board president. She also found, in the meeting minutes, that quorum, the minimum number of board members required to hold a valid vote, had not been reached at 30. One of the 57 board meetings held during Linda's tenure. Votes taken at those meetings, including several of the bylaw amendments, had no legal standing. Rachel organized her findings into a 20-page summary document with citations and exhibits. She called Mark Calloway, who had raised objections. He had found in several old meeting minutes as someone who had raised objections. She called Derek Walsh. She called James Whitfield. She organized a neighborhood meeting at the recreation center on a Thursday evening. 51 of 64 households attended. the highest turnout in the history of Maplewood Estates, by a very wide margin. Rachel stood at the front of the room with a projove, as for through everything she had found, methodical manner and had found. She did not editorialize. She did not raise her voice. I cited sources and answered questions. She brought printed copies of the key documents for anyone who wanted them. The room was extremely quiet during her presentation. When she finished, she said, I want to be clear about one thing. This is your neighborhood. These are your documents and your finances. What happens next is your decision. What I can tell you is what the law allows and what it requires, and what the law allows is for this board to be removed and replaced by a properly elected one. What it requires is that someone file a formal complaint. She set a blank complaint form on the table. She put a pen next to it. Nobody moved for about 4 seconds. Then Howard Finch, the retired judge from Chapter 4, walked to the table and picked up the pen. Then everyone started clapping. Howard signed first. Then 37 more people signed after him. Rachel filed the complaint with the State Real Estate Commission the following morning.